And what I'd like to do now is shift a little bit to a presentation by Dr. Chris Beck. He was the lead science advisor to the House Homeland Security. And by the way, later today, we will have the director of the Homeland Security Office on Cyber Awareness and Education to speak to us about this. And we are looking forward to greater cooperation and facilitation between the private sector, FBI, InfraGard, DHS, and also DoD. We'll hear from the Department of Defense today as well. Now, we're going to hear briefly from Dr. Chris Beck. He was the one who was the point person in the House Homeland Security offices to engage these scientific and technical matters. And since leaving that, he's been involved and continued his involvement working internationally, not only with the folks in critical infrastructure here, but across the world. And he's going to give us his take on the issues of both EMP as well as space weather from the EIS Council. Maybe you could take a moment to talk about the Council, and we'll have probably some time for questions as well. I think we're getting close to being back on track. Thank you, everybody. Chris.
Well, thank you, Chuck, for organizing this session, and to the Policy Study Organization for holding the Dupont Summit. I'd also like to thank Congressman Bartlett for your service and especially your leadership on this issue. As Chuck mentioned, a few years ago I was working for the House Committee on Homeland Security as the Science and Technology Advisor and Staff Director for Subcommittee on Cyber Security, Infrastructure Protection, and Science and Technology. And it was during that time that I first met Dr. Pry when he was working with you, and he handed me a copy of the EMP Commission report. And when I read that report, it really opened my eyes to the importance of this issue. And later on, I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to focus on it full time, and that's when I moved off the Hill and over to the Electric Infrastructure Security Council. So that's kind of where my journey on this road started. Now, let me tell you a little bit about EIS Council. Our mission is to work in partnership with government and corporate stakeholders to host national and international education, planning, and communication initiatives that help coordinate infrastructure protection against electromagnetic threats, or we call them E-threats, including naturally occurring geomagnetic disturbances, or GMD, high-altitude electromagnetic pulses from nuclear weapons, sometimes called HEMP, and non-nuclear EMP from intentional electromagnetic interference devices, or IEMI. EIS Council is also proud to co-host the Electric Infrastructure Security Summit Series, and that's what I'm going to be focusing on today. It's an annual it's an annual international government and NGO summit on infrastructure security. The third of those summits took place this year in May 14th and 15th in London in the UK's Houses of Parliament. It was co-chaired by Congressman Trent Franks, Congresswoman Yvette Clarke, and from the UK, the Right Honourable James Arbuthnot. The summit was a gathering of senior government representatives, scientists, and industry executives from 21 countries. Those included Albania, Australia, Bulgaria, Canada, Croatia, Estonia, France, Germany, India, Israel, Italy, the Republic of Korea, Latvia, Lithuania, Norway, Poland, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, the UK, and the US. And it was a very good event, and what I'm going to focus on here is a summary of the major themes and recommendations from that summit. First of all, the discussion started with defining the issue. What is the problem? Developed nations are vulnerable to serious national power grid damage from E-threats, both natural and malicious. What is the severity? The impact will range from, at minimum, a serious financial and economic crisis, to, at maximum, a catastrophe that would threaten societal continuity. And I think Congressman Bartlett laid out some of those consequences very well. The timing, well, for severe space weather, the most recent serious events occurred 90 and 150 years ago, respectively, but the precise timing of the next such occurrence, as with all extreme natural disasters, is unknown. For malicious EMP, either local, non-nuclear, or subcontinental nuclear, a strike could be induced by the ongoing vulnerability of our systems, coupled with rapidly changing geopolitical realities. The key questions we posed to the participants and the delegates would: should we respond to E-threats? Should we accept the status quo and minimize near-term costs by accepting growing vulnerability, or begin reducing that vulnerability? If we respond, if the answer to the first question is yes, what is the path? How should we address interconnect-wide interdependence? And how should we proceed with implementation? Third, if we respond, who should be involved? Who should take responsibility to find the path and implement it? Number 4, how broad should our response be? Should both GMD and EMP be included? So to go back and answer some of those questions, or to give you the consensus recommendations of the delegate, should we respond? A common theme of the summit deliberations, which was broadly accepted in all presentations and discussions, was that the risks associated with severe E-threats are serious, and it's time to begin taking positive actions to protect critical infrastructures. So we answer yes to the first question very definitively. Secondly, what is the path? The broad consensus of summit participants and other delegates was that we need to establish interconnect-wide standards and plans. For implementation, we should begin working aggressively to validate and implement specific protection measures, while also pursuing expanded modeling, priority assessment, and planning. More specifically, we need to define and apply interconnect-wide standards and protection plans. These can be implemented through regulatory or other means, and develop implementation plans that include prioritized protection for critical assets, because not every component of the grid, while connected, is not as critical as others. So having a risk-based approach that identifies the most critical assets makes the most sense when resources are scarce. We need to pursue 2 paths to implementation. One is to validate and implement specific cost-effective protection measures. We should thoroughly evaluate protection measures to validate that they support E-threat standards, including both procedural and hardware-based measures. This could include transformer and other hardware design upgrades, current blockers, series capacitance, and power substation EMI protection on the hardware side. If expectations for high effectiveness and low-cost hardware-based protection can be tested and demonstrated, this will become a core approach to mitigation, beginning with development of interconnect-wide protection planning. Second, prioritize scope and timing of protective measures by expanded hardware and interconnect-wide modeling, prioritization, and data collection. We should also pursue a path of data collection, hardware vulnerability modeling, and grid impact modeling, and define critical high-value asset protection priorities. The process will guide and prioritize cost-effective implementation measures, and it will be even more vital, in these cases where more expensive measures are needed. So that prioritization is important. Who should be involved? The sense of the summit presenters and delegates was that assembling and implementing a plan for E-threat protection will require the broadest possible participation among government agencies, commercial power suppliers, insurance companies, other stakeholders, each contributing in its own domain of authority and expertise. A common theme of all the discussions is the need to work towards international partnerships in developing these plans. And I think we saw at our summit some broadening of the base of folks interested. We had a good showing from the international insurance market, and I think this summit is another example of that, because we have a lot of people coming here with different backgrounds and expertise, and everyone is needed to participate. Finally, addressing EMP and IEMI, how broad should our scope be? The recommendations became clear that will be essential for both aspects of E-threats, both natural, space weather, and malicious, IEMI and hemp. In fact, another common theme at the summit was that in focusing on space weather, there's been insufficient attention given the needs for protection against malicious EMP and IEMI threats. In this regard, all the security-related speakers were quite clear. Security forces cannot perform their national security and protection missions without the partnership of commercial power suppliers, who will need to expand their resilience into a new hazard environment. The hope that the government could handle either the natural or malicious threat domain on its own was rejected, with the clearest articulation, in fact, of this reality coming from speakers who represented the responsible government departments and agencies, those being Defense and Homeland Security. I would like to note that there appear to be no significant technical or financial barriers to mitigating this threat. This is doable. The technologies needed are well understood, and the cost, based on both government estimates and recent corporate experience, is quite low, even in comparison with just existing logistics and maintenance budgets for affected equipment. Rather, the primary needs seem to be for education to increase awareness and willingness to address this problem, and for coordination to address the complex government and corporate administrative structures of even the most critical infrastructures. And again, I think this summit is another reflection of that, that getting together and talking across several areas of expertise, that this problem is solvable, and we ought to be able to move forward. I think with that, I'll conclude my remarks. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Dr. Beck. I have the microphone. I'd like to make certain any of you could have a quick question or two. We have time for a few. I'll have one for Dr. Beck. In terms of next steps, I know this is the third time you've done this summit. You seem to have growing involvement from a number of different countries. What do you think is the practical next step you think either the members of your group will be taking or your own council might be taking in light of what you've been learning now that you've done this 3 times over?
Well, let me first say that there will be the summit in May was the 3rd summit. We do plan on having a 4th summit this spring or summer, and I would just like to say, I forgot in my concluding remarks to say that I was basically summarizing the conclusions and recommendations report from the 3rd summit. I'm sorry I didn't have enough copies for everybody and didn't want to carry them all here anyway. But it's very easy to download at EISSummit, all one word, .com. And if you go to the agenda tab, the very first link you see is you can download the recommendations report and read through it yourself. Also, there is archives of the first 2 summits. So to answer your question, we are moving. For each of the summits has been a progression. The very first summit was basically all EIS hosted a bringing together of government officials. Our chairman, Avi Schnur, likes to joke about the fact that when he agreed to become the CEO and chairman of EIS Council, that he was approached by he had been talking about the problem of EMP and GMD to different government officials, and they said, wow, we really need to work on this, and we really ought to do this in an international way, because at least GMD to date has affected several countries, South Africa, Sweden, Canada, the United States, and so on. We really should get together and talk about this. Now, if we try to do this via direct government-to-government negotiations and contacts, it'll take about 10 years. If we do it through an NGO, it should take about 10 months. So it was the fact that we're a sort of neutral third party that could make the introductions, bring everyone together in the auspices of a summit to discuss that kicked things off. But so the first summit was basically, what is this threat? And some government officials were involved. The second summit, there was a little bit of growing knowledge and interest in the problem, so we were able to bring in some energy sector transmission owner and operators to discuss the issue as well. So there was a government to industry nexus, and so the onus from that summit leading to the third one was, come back and tell us what you've done. And so what we heard in the third summit was the beginnings of some concrete steps that, for example, the United Kingdom has elevated GMD to their top threat level of natural and malicious threats that they look at. That Israel is looking at its grid protection, that Sweden had set a standard for their transformer withstand to geomagnetically induced currents. So that was a step to say, what steps have you taken? And now, in the fourth summit, we hope to go beyond that to a broader discussion of more activity and next steps for really national and international standards. And we're starting to see that here in the United States as well.
Thank you. Now, if you're one of the lucky winners who get to ask a question, I'd just also like to ask you to identify yourself as I hand the mic to you. We have another question here.
Yes, Bob Kaufman. It sounds, even from the first few speakers, that one of the key areas of resistance in the U.S. seems to be the electric industry itself. Are there any ways or ideas about how to get a buy-in from the electric industry in the U.S. so they become a participant instead of an obstructor of getting this protection accomplished?
Well, there's a couple ways. One is continued education. I think, those of us that have been discussing this for a long time have been somewhat flummoxed by what is the resistance. I think it comes from a few areas. One is certainly a concern about cost. Now, I think the natural tendency is to say, as Congressman Bartlett noted in several of the reports, well, if we have a worst-case scenario, we're talking about several months to even a couple of years of a grid outage. It could cost $1 to $2 trillion. These are figures from National Academy of Sciences NASA report. And so I think the reaction is, well, if the problem is that big, then the cost to prevent it is probably in the same ballpark. And I think what we're finding out is that that is in fact not the case. Secondly, there have been some movement in the NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Council, or Corporation, has convened a task force on geomagnetic disturbances, so there's some discussion there within the industry. Though that isn't getting out yet as much as it should, so that further education, I think understanding of what the parameters of a geomagnetic disturbance might look like and what the protection options are. So I think, and finally, we know that the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission just issued a notice of proposed rulemaking in October on GMD threats. So I think this combination of education, understanding the problem better, and a interest by regulators, because a national problem such as this, it's probably going to take, especially with the U.S. electric grid as complicated as it is, and with the large number of players across all these states, jurisdictions, that some kind of national plan is necessary, and it will probably require a standard set by the federal government to do that. But I think those components of education and some regulation are probably the things that will move it forward.
Thank you. Do we have another question? Yes.
Yeah, hi. My name is Joe O'Leary, and introduction, about 35 years telecommunications industry, and I just wanted to offer just some insight rather than a question. And I want to say that, you know, a lot of things are within our control. It's just a matter of implementing what we already know, what we already have. You know, I heard the cyber discussion earlier, and I do a risk analysis right now, and we'll find a place that hasn't changed their default passwords on their, you know, network interfaces. You know, I've got customers, I've had customers.
It's a small step, but I do have passwords on all my stuff.
There you go. Exactly. And just, you know, if it worked this year, check it again next year. You know, I've put together networks for customers. I've worked with the, you know, both on the DoD side. I'm a National Guardsman, and I've worked, and that allows me to work as a civilian as well. So I've worked with corporate, you know, commercial customers, and we've put together networks with diversity, primary backup circuits. But over the course of years, these circuits will self-heal, or they'll be rerouted and can very possibly go through the same infrastructure. You lose that diversity of the network. So I would just recommend, don't accept things on a face level. Just because the box was checked last year, check it again this year, because you may have lost some of that redundancy.
Right. I think the standards need to evolve as we better understand things. As changes are made to the grid, that changes the you know, the physics of the system, and so updates have to be continuous. And finally, you know, once there is better buy-in from the industry, I think that we'll have a less protected grid if some regulation is thou shalt do A, B, C, D, just like what you're talking about. Well, you check those boxes and you're done, versus thinking and understanding the problem. Those people that are charged with running it are going to come up with the right solutions for their system in the context of a larger system, and that's, you know, having that cognitive process is important to doing it right.
We have one more question.
Hi, my name is Frank Sandow. I'm in the aerospace and defense industry. Kind of ignorant on this topic. So the question I had, you talk about, I heard it 2 times now, about the technologies existing. What I don't understand or haven't seen in my career is, can I go buy EMP protected stuff? So if I'm the power companies in power grid today, or the distribution, creation, and management of power, they have the ability to go out today and actually buy these things? Or maybe a better question is, if the government said, we want to fix this problem and here's all this money, can this problem be fixed tomorrow if the money was available? Does the supply chain exist? Do these technologies exist to actually implement these fixes to protect our infrastructure?
Sure. The short answer is yes. There are technologies that are in use all over grids. For example, just to address the geomagnetically induced currents, which are basically a quasi-DC currents that flow through the grid and cause overheating and damage to transformers. There's a technology called a series capacitor, which has not been used or was not implemented for the purpose of blocking these DC currents. It was implemented because it dials in the line impedance that makes the transmission of AC power as efficient as possible, but it has a secondary effect of blocking DC currents. So there's a technology that's in use, but it's not in use everywhere. It could be used. Because of the new interest in this area, and because the transformers are the things that are damaged, there have been technologies developed very recently that actually work right at the transformer, called DC current blockers. And so those are an emerging technology, but I would say at this point I would consider them available. They exist. On the other side, there's two components to an EMP attack. With a GMD attack or GMD incident, you just get the geomagnetically induced currents that flow through the lines. But with a nuclear explosion, for example, you also get very high frequency energy pulses. So those can damage electronics. But as Mr. Bartlett noted, we've been protecting military systems from this kind of radiation for years. So basically, you put a metal box around it, and it shields the delicate electronics inside from that electric field. And so those exist as well. So that there may be some new configuring that has to be done to fit it to a particular substation or to a particular SCADA system. But the fundamental technology, it's not like we need to figure out a neutrino detector or find the Higgs boson to do this. I mean, this is more or less off-the-shelf technology at this point.
Thank you, Dr. Beck. And throughout the course of the day, you'll see in your program that we'll have a number of companies that are announcing some of their technology as well in these various areas, including microgrids and others. But I'd like to have a quick round of applause for Dr. Beck and his work.